My retelling of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. The story begins with these two guys. One of them is named Lenny, who has a round face, and his friend George, who has a square face that you can distinguish them. And as I mentioned, they are friends, and they're migrant workers, but they travel together instead of alone. And they travel through California, through a city named Salinas, looking for jobs on farms. They have this one big dream of one day owning their own farm and having the house and the barn and a windmill and trees obviously surrounding the farm and a pig and cows. And then Lenny really wants to have rabbits because they're really soft, so George always tells him that one day they will have his rabbits. And they're an odd pairing. They don't really seem like to go together, and George has always been there for Lenny, and Lenny relies on George. And the scene changes to a pond, and they're sitting there after a long day of walking, and they're talking, and then George notices Lenny has something in his pocket, and he asks him to take it out, and it turns out to be a dead mouse. So George becomes angry and asks him what he's doing, and he decides to throw away the mouse. Bye-bye. And he is screaming at Lenny because at their last farm, Lenny got in trouble because he saw this woman with a red dress, and he got curious. He wanted to touch it because he thought it was really pretty. So he went and he grabbed it, and sorry for the long awkward arm, but he went and he grabbed it and he thought it was pretty, but the woman screamed rape, so then the next day they were fired. Lenny asks George why they're different from other migrant workers, and George tells him it's because they're not lonely, they have each other, and they actually have a dream to hope for in the future, which is their farm. And George also tells Lenny that if he runs into trouble in their new farm, to come back to the pond because he'll be safe there. The scene changes and they've arrived at their new farm, and their boss is telling them what their new job will be is to pass bags of barley into trucks. And then we meet the character of Candy, and he has a dog who's really old, and sorry, I cannot draw to save my life, but we will pretend this is a dog. And we will also make Candy's hair red so we can distinguish him for later. And they're just talking, and then Curly, the boss's son, walks in, and he has blue hair, and he's basically a jerk. And Candy just explains it's because he's scared of Lenny. Then Curly's wife comes in, and she is basically known to flirt with everyone. So Lenny just stares at her, doesn't say anything, and then George just ignores her to avoid trouble. Sometime later in the book that isn't specified, the scene changes, and then we have Slim, who has green hair for this, and George is thanking Slim for giving Lenny a puppy from his new litter. And George explains that Lenny and George have known each other since they were little. They were born in the same place. He was there for Lenny's aunt's funeral, and then after that they just stuck together and they were friends. And George used to play really mean jokes on Lenny, but then one day he tricked Lenny into going into a pond, but Lenny could not swim, so he was drowning, and after that he had no more jokes to play on Lenny. The scene changes, and they're in their bunk rooms with the bunk beds, and we have Lenny, we have George, we have Candy, we have a bunch of other workers, and then we see the workers telling Candy that they should kill the dog because it smells and it's old. And at first he says no, but then he changes his mind. He says okay. So he just lies down on his bed, and he's just upset because they're going to kill his dog, and killing a dog is pretty sad. So he's there with a sad face, and then you hear a shot outside, and that's how we know the dog died. And then the scene changes, and Curly comes in demanding to know where his wife and Slim is, and a worker says that Slim is in the barn, and Curly assumes that Slim and his wife are together and gets mad. Lenny asks George to again tell him about the farm that they're going to have one day, and it describes 10 acres and a house, and they're going to have a barn, and they're also going to have a windmill, and that looks like a flower. I'm sorry, this looks much more like a windmill. And they're also going to have trees, and they're going to be surrounded by trees, and they're going to have a little pig that says oink, and a cow, and Lenny will finally have his rabbits in a pen for him to take care of and care for. Candy overhears them, and then he decides to ask them if he can join because he has money saved up. And then George decides that there's no problem with that. He says, of course, and they decide to wait 1 more month to get more pay. Then Curly and Slim come in, and Curly's apologizing, and then Curly sees that Lenny's smiling, and he assumes that Lenny is making fun of him and thinks he's being an idiot. So he decides to start punching and hitting Lenny, and Lenny doesn't want to fight, but he goes to stop Curly's hand, and he crushes it, which causes immense pain for Curly because his bones are being broken. And then we see that Candy, which I cannot draw for some reason, and George, they're talking, and George asks if they're going to be fired for this, but Candy decides to tell Curly that he cannot say that Lenny hurt him. He should say that he got hurt by a machine, or else he'll just be embarrassed that Lenny was the one who actually broke his hand. And then the scene changes, and Lenny is with one of the black workers, and Candy goes to look for him, and then they all decide to be there and sit and just talk, and they're just having conversation. And then Curly's wife decides to walk in, and she wants to know where her husband is. So she's asking them, where's my husband? And then they all know that she's trouble, so Candy tells her to go away, and then the black worker tells her to get out of his room. And she's basically a really big jerk, and she acts like a queen, and she tells him that it's not even funny how fast she could get him lynched. Then the scene changes, and Lenny's in the barn with the dog, and he's asking the dog why did he have to die, because he accidentally killed the dog while he was trying to play with it and take care of it. And it wasn't intentional, he just did it by accident. But he's asking, why little doggy, why did you have to die? I didn't want you to. And then Curly's wife walks in, and she asks him what he's doing. And he tells her, I didn't mean to, it wasn't on purpose, I just like petting soft things. And then she sees that he's upset, so she tries to comfort him. She's like, oh, it's okay, I understand. I like to pet soft things too. And she's just trying to be nice to him because you can see it wasn't intentional. It wasn't on purpose that he killed the dog. So then she tells him that he can pet her hair. He can stroke it because it's soft and she likes to do it too. So he decides, okay, I'll go touch her hair. She said it's okay. But by accident, instead of just stroking it softly and just touching it, he does it too harshly, and it starts to hurt her, so she starts to scream and say ow, ow, ow. And then this causes Lenny to freak out, and he gets nervous and he doesn't know what to do, so he covers her mouth, and he starts to shake her, and then he accidentally ends up doing something he shouldn't. Apparently afterwards he ended up killing her, and he didn't know what to do. She was just lying there, and she was dead. She wasn't breathing, she wasn't moving. He realized what he had done. He got upset because now he didn't know what to do. He knew George would be mad at him. He knew he made a mistake, and then he remembered George telling him that if there was ever a problem, he had to go back to the pond because that's where he would be safe. So he knew that's what he had to do. Candy's the first one to find the body, and he immediately goes to get George. And when they come back, they both have the same thought. They both know who's responsible for this. They both know it was Lenny. And they both know that Curly is going to be completely angry. And Candy asks George if they are going to still get the farm. Like, is it still a possibility? Were they even ever going to get the farm? And George admits that the farm wasn't really a definite idea. It was just a dream, and just a dream. It wasn't supposed to happen. And then all the other workers start to come in, and they all see what's happened. They all know it was Lenny, and Curly sees that his wife is dead, and he knows it was Lenny, and he basically says that he wants Lenny dead. So he tells them that they all have to go and find Lenny, and they must go in. The scene changes, and Lenny's back at the pond, and he begins to hallucinate, and he's wondering why he messes up. And he imagines his Aunt Clara, and she's telling him that it's his fault why George can never do anything, why George always gets in trouble, why George had to leave the last farm. Like, it's his fault. He holds George back and basically tells him that it's his fault that George can't be successful. And then we have a bunny, and sorry I didn't draw it, but I suck at drawing bunnies. So here's a nice little picture. And the bunny is basically reminding him that now he can't have the bunny. He can't have what he really wanted. He can't have the soft thing. Because he made this mistake, now he has to suffer the consequences. And it's basically really upsetting to him, and he really wanted this, and he's just realizing all the consequences. And I wrote oh ho, and he's not Santa, so let me fix it to a no. Sorry. And then after a little bit, George finds him, and Lenny asks why are they so different, and he also asks George to tell him about the farm that one day they're gonna own, because he just wants to hear it again. And then George tells him, okay, I'll tell you about the farm, and I'll tell you why we're different, but give me your hat, because in his hat was the gun. And sorry I didn't draw the hat, but I don't know how to really draw, and it's simpler if I just tell you. So he asked him for the gun, and then he gives him the gun, and while Lenny's imagining everything, and he's picturing the farm, and he's picturing all the rabbits that he could have, George does the one thing he has to do, and he shoots his friend, and that kills him. And then everyone comes and finds him, and only Curly's happy because Curly wanted him dead, but no one else did because they knew he didn't do anything on purpose. And everyone's sad, and George is sad, but Curly is obviously cheering. And that is the end to a very sad story between two friends. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it even though my drawing sucks.